Okay. Hi, welcome. I'm Christine Kirkpatrick. I'm the Division Director of Research Data Services at the San Diego Supercomputer Center at the University of California, San Diego, and the home for the GoFair US office. For those who aren't familiar with GoFair and where it resides in the data ecosystem, this graphic explains a bit more. Though in planning for months, this graphic accompanied a statement issued during the pandemic and highlights the complementarity and how CODATA, the Research Data Alliance, the World Data System, and GoFair can work together to address data issues. While each organization plays an important role in our work, we were attracted to GoFair because of its focus on implementation and machine actionability. As we became more deeply involved, we saw a gap in connecting what was happening in the EU to the developing FAIR services, or rather lack thereof, in the United States. This led us to found the US GoFair Coordination Office at SDSC. Our goal is to find working models and to bring them back for US audiences in a way that is relevant to the academic and funding landscape here. GoFair is organized along 3 pillars: Go Change, Go Train, and Go Build. Go Change focuses on policies, incentives, and priorities. Go Train on training and skill development, including basic awareness of FAIR. And Build focuses on FAIR technology. Implementation networks represent areas of special focus, sometimes in a particular domain. And here you can see some of the current implementation networks and where they fall along these pillars. GoFair includes an international coordination office and several country offices. Here we are last year together in Leiden for the annual Implementation Networks meeting. And this year's meeting in 2020 in Hamburg had such a big group, it doesn't make as good of a picture to show. So we are growing. Even though the Go and GoFair stands for Global Open, it is also synonymous with the energy of the team. We are action-oriented and use various methods for coming at problems in new ways. Just to say a little bit more about the Bodan Implementation Network, which was at the bottom of the list of implementation networks on a previous slide, partly because it's timely, but also because it's a good example of what GoFair is about. Within Bodan, we have the project Bodan Africa, funded in part by the Phillips Foundation and chaired by Dr. Mohamed Mapeza Mahigo, with Dr. Francesca Owadipu as executive coordinator, both from Kampala International University in Uganda. Another huge supporting force is Professor Dr. Miriam Ben Ryson from Leiden University. This initiative works on 3 very complementary projects related to capacity building for FAIR in the US. The first is the need to train up the data stewardship workforce. The materials and the way of organizing the network of data stewards can be directly applied back here in the US. Second is the focus on metadata for machines. This is part of the skill building for the data stewards. Through a series of workshops, they are able to find gaps in metadata practices and build things from the ground up where needed. This culminates in the use of FAIR data points, another point of convergence for people who work in GoFair. Rather than use the old model of trying to collect all of the data you need into a data lake, the idea is that published data can be visited, even if this is just the metadata about the data that resides there. This allows algorithms to visit data points and to collect information that they either have access to or that is open and available. It is through these 3 efforts that Bodan Africa is working to create data stewardship capacity, along with the infrastructure that can be used for this pandemic and future challenges. GoFair US works across the research computing landscape to find the best FAIR data ecosystem tools and practices available. Among our current and past offerings are data awareness and more in-depth data stewardship training offerings. This picture is from our first week-long data stewardship training held at SDSC in 2019. This is Mark Wilkinson, who is lead author on the seminal FAIR paper from 2016. And here, and I think I saw a few of you on the webinar that are in this picture. This was for me and perhaps for you, my last trip on a plane before the lockdown. February in Atlanta, Georgia, for our workshop we held about advancing FAIR capacity in the US, hosted by the South Big Data Innovation Hub. Through this initial group, we're building a community of people in the US who want to build out the fair data ecosystem of tools, especially adapted for US needs. We have broad participation across institutions and organizations with funding from different US agencies, as well as consultants ready to begin filling the gap of the estimated 500,000 data stewards that will be needed in our country over the next few years. As part of the Force 11 Scholarly Communications Institute this summer, Melissa Cragen, also at SDSC, and Natalie Meyer from Notre Dame and I created a template for organizations to use for assessment and then mapping of their institutional goals with FAIR. The template's called the Fair Data Stewardship Plan for Organizations and Institutions. This is now part of the 3-point verification handbook mentioned on the next slide, but reach out if you'd like a copy and more information. We work to connect implementation networks in the US, especially where there's great interest. 2020 saw the first implementation network to come out of the US, the Fair Microbiome Island. We are an active member of BODAN and BODAN Africa for the reasons I mentioned before. And in partnership with the West Big Data Innovation Hub, we hosted a 4-part webinar series on BODAN this past spring, and then at the intersection of COVID data science and FAIR. And then we had a follow-up 3-part series on BODAN Africa that examined the pandemic from the lens of each partner country, as well as common approaches and challenges. We also look towards what gaps need filling, especially coming from a research computing organization. In particular, we are standing up Fair Data Point proof of concepts and are growing that into a network of FDPs. Late this summer, we launched the new GoFair US website that details all of the different communication channels available, as well as our initiatives. See the ways to be engaged, including contributing to our reusable carpentries inspired lesson on FAIR and the 3-point verification handbook. And I just want to say how thankful we are to our partners. I especially want to highlight Renzi and Chris Erdman from Renzi, who have joined us on the GoFair US Office Declaration, Juliane Schneider from Sage Bionetworks, and Nancy Hobel-Heinrich for joining us in our US office. Now I'll turn it over to Juliane for our main presentation.
All righty, let's see if I can get my screen. Oh, did it share? No.
Not quite.
Okay. That's interesting.
Well, and I could share it if you prefer.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out. I don't see anywhere. It's not letting me share.
Okay, says all panelists can share.
Seeing.
Let me try. Added one more checkbox.
Good time zone, whichever you are in. I'm Juliane Schneider. I am a senior bioinformatics analyst and data liaison for Sage Bionetworks. I have spent a good 20+ years being a librarian and a data person from all different sorts of angles. So I've worked as an insurance librarian on Wall Street in New York City, worked for NYU Medical Center. I was a database designer for EBSCO, worked for UC San Diego as a metadata consultant for their research data curation program. And I've been the metadata librarian for Harvard Medical School's library. So I've seen data from all angles and many disciplines. And so I'm here to talk about fair data principles, but on a very basic level. Oh, and forward, yes. And click again. And historical figures find data principles oblique and faintly annoying, but they're wrong. And this is also fake, of course, because she's dead. And advance. And the official description is they are a set of principles that describe the attributes data need to, oh, you're blocking it, to have to enable and enhance reuse by humans and machines. Forward. And I'm not going to go through every single bullet point under each letter. I'm going to take the approach of how you in your role might experience the FAIR data principles and where you might go in your institution to find other people that are dealing with them in other capacities. If you want to see the full set, there's the link to the FAIR data principles. We'll be sharing this afterwards so you can get these links. The seminal paper that Christine mentioned is the second link. And the third link is a sort of step-by-step process of how a group of people who managed a repository called Firebase used the FAIR principles to sort of evaluate their tool. And I thought that was really helpful and a really interesting way to apply them. And I used them to evaluate my database, which was Eagle Eye, which I managed for Catalyst, Harvard Catalyst. Forward. These are the things that are important to the FAIR data principles. Machine readability is a big one. The FAIR data principles are really about constructing metadata that is machine readable so that it extends its interoperability, it can communicate with other machines, and there are clear stated rules about how you can use the data that the metadata is describing. Forward. The things that FAIR does not care about is humans, really. I mean, they kind of care about us in the sense that we're the people trying to find things and use things. But when it comes to applying the metadata, it's really more about making that data machine readable and useful. It's not a set of rules. Like, you don't have to go down each one and check them off. They're guidelines, and they don't mention specific tools or methods, and they don't mention specific domains. These are completely agnostic principles that are about data. Forward. It is not, and this is one of the biggest misconceptions about FAIR. It is not about open access. It's about finding things and accessibility. Accessibility means being able to access the metadata. It doesn't mean usage as I can download everything all the time whenever I want. That's not what FAIR is about. FAIR is about being able to find things and reuse them according to usage rules. Forward. For instance, we have the FERPA laws for student information and HIPAA laws for medical information. This is data that should not be open access, that is not accessible, and there's good reasons for that. So not everything should be open access. However, it can be FAIR in its own community standardy way. Forward. These are the FAIR data principles on a page. And if you look at them, there's a theme. Christine, if you just want to start hitting the button, I have a whole bunch of, yes, red circles. Keep going until it goes down to the last one. The theme is metadata. There we go. And the FAIR data principles as applied are obviously extremely metadata heavy. And right now I want to look at that last one that says metadata meet domain relevant community standards. So forward. Communities don't exist in boxes. They communicate a lot. So all these amoebas are all wanting to ask each other questions and know what's going on with the paramecium down in the corner. Communities are the same way. They ask each other questions. They want to know things about what the other community is doing so that they can work together, because science crosses communities in a lot of ways, and it's becoming more and more so. Forward. I've been working in bioinformatics for a while, and I've worked with all of these people. Clinicians have EHR data. We have biologists who have their ontologies and geneticists who use their own ontologies. Computer scientists speak in the language of software and algorithms. Data curators touch everything. Even grant administrators you have to work with for things like data use agreements and funding requirements. Anyone doing science, especially in bioinformatics, in this example, touches all of these. So what is my community forward? Do I choose one of them? Do I choose all of them? If I am managing a repository, there's the repository community that I have to work with. So it's not just sciencey stuff, it's communities based on things like tools and repositories. Forward. And when I think about, well, what community should I choose? It's the answer I give when someone asks me about metadata, which is, it depends. And I know that is a really annoying answer, but it's the true answer. FAIR is a tool to use to find solutions for sharing your data in the way you need it to be shared. And that takes some thought, because you have to think outside of the way you need it to be shared, and also think about how and who you want to share it with. The answers may not be obvious, because interdisciplinary science is expanding. I remember when I was at Countway, we had the famous skull of Phineas Gage, who got a massive tamping iron through his skull and survived for many years afterward, and we had the skull. And we had an artist who wanted to come in and do a 3D rendering of the skull for an art exhibit, and we ended up with this wild 3-dimensional CAD file data. So art met science. It's not clear cut. Forward. One of the interesting things that's happening around this, as far as communities and disciplines go, is something called convergence. And the Go Fair Europe group is part of this symposium that is looking at all the disciplines, not all of them, but the ones who are participating, and seeing how they handle FAIR. What persistent identifier are they using for their data sets? What ontologies are they using? Schemas, data structures, all of that. Which ones do we have in common, and where do they diverge? And even when they diverge, are the disciplinary specific ones, are there still some that are communally used across a certain subset of disciplines? I think this could be really interesting to see what kind of metadata is widely community shared and where those diversions branch off. I think it'll be a really interesting event. So that's coming up November 27th and December 4th. Forward. Meanwhile, forward. FAIR is actually a team sport. Never FAIR alone, because it will just get frustrating, because not everybody uses FAIR for their role. Forward. If you're looking at the findability aspect of FAIR, it looks at the metadata. Is it indexed anywhere? So if you're using metadata, is it part of an ontology? Are you using a schema like Dublin Core? Are you using the persistent identifiers from that schema or ontology in your repository so that the machine can point out to the URI for the term? I hope that makes sense to everyone. I'm getting ontological here, but long story short, do you have a schema, and is it available for other people to see? And do those metadata terms have persistent identifiers? And is the data described with rich metadata? Well, again, what does rich metadata mean? That is sort of up to you. In a way, FAIR is often setting up standards and then comparing yourself to where you want to be. That's part of why it's so general, because really you're evaluating yourself against where you want to go. And if you're looking for, well, is the repository where I'm putting my data, is there metadata indexed? Well, you'd probably go to, if you're in an academic institution, go to the library or the repository team, or possibly your IT group might know whether the metadata is indexed. Or if you're in a non-academic repository, you'd probably go to the owner of that repository and ask them. And if you're thinking about the rich metadata, either the creator of the metadata or the librarian who's working with them to describe their data would have that kind of information, and would probably be able to tell you what they mean by rich metadata, because everyone has a different answer for that one. Forward. Accessibility is about using protocols that work with different machines. HTTPS is a protocol, or HTTP is a protocol. Generally, if you want to know what protocols you're using, your IT department would know that, the repository group might know that. The second bullet's sort of interesting. It allows for authentication and authorization when necessary. For instance, EagleEye was a totally open repository of research objects. You could search on for an instrument or a transgenic mice. You could find the record for it. You could contact that person and see if they have available mice. Totally open. However, we did have an editing suite for entering records, and that was only closed, or that was only open to people who were part of, who were managing the EagleEye node. So we had a authentication process to get into our editing suite for those who were allowed to add records. So on one level, our protocol was totally open. On the other, we did have that authorization procedure for our editing suite. And a really important part of this is having metadata accessible even when data are no longer available. If you cite data and it later down the road, it's decided that they were no longer going to make it accessible, or it was lost somehow, if the metadata goes away, there's no way to show that that ever existed or was accessible. So it's really crucial to keep sort of ghost metadata out there to say, yes, this thing once existed and was accessible, and they weren't lying when they cited it. And if you're looking for that portion, if you're going for the actual communications protocols, that tends to be more of an IT thing, I found. If it's about the metadata being accessible and how long it's accessible, that tends to be the realm of the librarians, curators, or the repository group. Because responsibility for this can often change from institution to institution. Where data repositories sit and who's in charge of them and who's in charge of metadata can vary greatly wherever you are. It depends on where it landed when they decided to build the thing. Forward. Interoperability means that you are not in a silo. You are able to take your data, put metadata on it, and make it accessible through various tools, repositories, search engines, etc. The way you do that is use a schema, schema.org, there's Dublin Core, there's a bunch of different schemas you can use for describing data, software, etc. And you also use ontologies and vocabularies. That way, everyone's using the same term with attached synonyms, and you're able to find things across systems and across repositories. You can also include qualified references to other metadata. For instance, if you have data and you have a software that is used to work with that data, you want to be able to link the metadata. There has to be some metadata in the record for the data that is linked to the software used to run it. Most of this information will come from the librarians, data curators, the repository, the owners of the repository will have that kind of information if that's what you're looking for. Forward. And finally, reusability. Reusability is not reproducibility. That's the other big misconception about FAIR. The R is not reproducibility. That concerns reproducing experiments and reproducing research in science. This is reusability. It's the ability to reuse data. And that means having a clear set of rules for how you access and use it. And it means having the kind of metadata that allows you to know, I need to use this script, I need to use this software, this is how large the file is, you need this to download it, etc. Making sure that you have enough information for someone looking at your data to use it. Again, metadata meet domain relevant community standards, whatever those are. Kind of decide which ones you think are important and apply them, whether that means using an ontology, using some kind of schema. When I was working with oceanographers, geodata was really important. So we did a lot of work on making sure that was up to spec with ISO 19115. Most of this information, again, it keeps going back to the librarians and the repositories. If your data isn't in a repository, wherever you put it, you need to think about how you apply your metadata so that somehow it gets discoverable. The metadata that are associated with their provenance means that it's metadata that is associated with where things have been. So who created them, when they were created. If you look at the parentheses, it's talking about the metadata and the data. So it's both things. When were they created, who created them, where were they created, the versioning. You really need to know the version of the software used when you're talking about research data. So software versioning can be really important. And data creators are the ones that really know what the community standards are that they're shooting for when they're wanting to share their data in any particular repository. I'm losing my voice. Christine, forward. And this is all fine and good. I'm talking all these, all this metadata, but can you actually use the FAIR data principles for anything? Forward. Yes, yes you can. They're usable. Forward. We got a free. The ways you can use FAIR. Funders are requiring more and more for data to be fair. If you want to be cited, you need to be discovered. And so making your data discoverable to your colleagues and collaborators is a good idea. Building tools and technologies and repositories that work with the FAIR data principles can be super useful, especially when it comes to things like interoperability and some of that cross-disciplinary discovery. And finally, you know, Europe is way ahead of us on FAIR. They got really organized and there's a lot going on. In the US, not so much. So, you could just, if you wanted to stymie an administrator, you can start dropping FAIR and then, you get invited to present on it because you're the one that knows what it is. Forward. Some of the funder requirements I've seen that are fairish are the requirement to be uploaded to an open access repository, which means open access to the repository and to the metadata, not necessarily accessing the data itself. I've seen some requirements for standards like the date standard and the geospatial standard. I know the geospatial 19115 is required for a lot of federal grants from, I think, like Department of Energy, NOAA, things like that. Try to apply an ontology to your data. That's very helpful, and it does cover quite a few of the FAIR points. That's a good win because you can check off a lot if you're using some ontologies. And finally, get some PIDs. Those are almost always required, and there will be someone in your institution that can get you one. Either the funding office, probably not, but maybe the library, not the Scalcom office, the other one, Office for Research Computing might as well, actually. So anyway, there's a lot of places you can get a PID for your data and your metadata. Forward. So this is how some of the funders are looking at FAIR right now. There is the Go FAIR funder cycle. It's European, and they're trying to figure out how to realistically mandate and produce FAIR research outputs. I love their practicality. Realistically produce, because honestly, this is a lot. It's a lot to put into place if you don't have it already, and backtracking is never fun. So going back to a repository and trying to implement some of this is a big undertaking. Forward. The Open Research Funders Group I find really interesting. It's a group of funders who are looking to make federal grant recipients apply the FAIR data principles. So that's something that's sort of interesting to look at what they're doing. Forward. And finally, NIH they have their strategic plan for data science, and they talk a lot about FAIR in that document. Forward. Industry is also interested in FAIR because they want to build the tools that institutions and others can use, because those institutions are looking at funding that requires them to be fair. So industry is getting involved because they produce services and tools to do that, or they want to. So the FAIR Plus is looking to develop tools and guidelines for life science data. So this is life science based. It has 22 partners from academia and industry. And next slide. And here's their goals. It's training, which I think is great. We all need some training. Along with developing some guidelines and tools, organizing some events, and to change and sustain the data management culture in pharma, academia, and SMEs. Yeah, they're not ambitious at all. That's a big ask. But these are, I think, really an interesting set of goals, and it'll be interesting to see what comes out of this particular collaboration. Next. For researchers, you need to meet some funder requirements, make your data discoverable, get that rich metadata onto your data sets, and use your standards and formats. Especially add metadata that points to things like related scripts and discipline-related ontologies. Again, using an ontology is a big win when it comes to fair data principles because it knocks off a lot of those, you should have this. That, having a PID, and having a data use agreement are three things that really can get you ahead of the FAIR curve. And the rest of it you can sort of work on as things go. But those are the ones that give you a big bang for your buck. All right. Librarians have to deal with all of it, pretty much, because we tend to run the repositories, and in industry too, the data curators are the ones that overlook, annotate, add, make sure that everything's in order, keeping up with standards and ontologies because they change all the time. And in academic libraries, metadata librarians and disciplinary librarians need to kind of mesh and figure out what FAIR means for the different disciplines, and the metadata librarians can then start tying things together a little bit with the services they offer and things like ontologies. Librarians need to know what the good repositories are, either institutionally or discipline-based. And there's a couple of groups that certify repositories as trustworthy. There's a couple of links there. And click. Back one. All of this changes, all of it. I've seen repositories come and go. I've seen ontologies come and go. All of this is now grant-based like everything else in this world. So sustainability has taken a huge hit in the last, I'd say, 7 to 10 years. Ontologies are constantly changing, and the communities that use them are constantly changing. So you can never count on picking an ontology and expecting it to be universally adopted. It's really tough. So librarians have a really hard job keeping ahead of a lot of this, but they do. So next slide. One of the really great resources for looking at how disciplines look at FAIR is the 10 data and software things set of their web pages, I think GitHub based. And it was a project that was started by several different groups, and they had a sprint. It was an international global sprint of 24 hours, and they all chose a discipline and decided to create 10 FAIR data and software things. So they talk, it's more or less, they talk about FAIR and what, how FAIR is used in astronomy, nanotechnology, music. And it's fascinating to go into these because even though they're slightly the same format-wise, they're all very different in how they think about FAIR and how they apply it, and the things, the tools and the ontologies, the metadata they use. It's a really interesting resource. And it's a really great way to look at a discipline if you want to just sort of step into it and see where to start. It's a really good resource. So there's those, and then the next page, there's even more. I think they're still ongoing. They're still being added to. There's a link to the main page that lists all these at the end of the slide deck. So you can get the link there. But I really advise, if you're interested in any of these disciplines, start there and see what's there. Because it's really interesting to look at. Forward. My advice over a lot of disciplines and a lot of experience with ontologies and tools and repositories, go over the FAIR bullet points and figure out who else in your institution this affects, or who would work with these sort of things, metadata, obviously. And figure out who those are, and maybe sit down and have some coffee and just map out, well, how can we answer these questions and who can answer those questions for us? And which of these can we do now and which of these might we do later? Figure out which communities you are targeting with a library. That could be a whole lot because you might be just like the answer is all of them. If you aren't a library or a big institution, figure out your community, figure out your standards, and figure out what's needed and then what is nice to have, and then work from there. Getting persistent identifiers for your data sets is a really good idea, and also for your metadata. If you can find metadata that is in an OWL format that has URIs and is usable for you, that's a great big win. And just know what data standards are applicable to you and make sure that you're using them. Forward. One of the big challenges, what kind of metadata do we all have in common and where do we diverge across disciplines? Because again, FAIR is all about interoperability and accessibility, and discoverability and reusability. Knowing where we meet is really important for this to work well. And again, I just did the link again to the FAIR Convergence Symposium. Maybe this will be a good start to try to figure that out. But it's a big challenge for it, especially since ontologies and tools and schemas keep changing. That's been, oh dear, things are blinking. Okay, might be my monitor. Other challenges are that FAIR is a guideline and not rules. So, nobody's insisting that we do any of this. And they're very broad. They're not disciplinary based. They're not, you need to use this tool to do this. It's something that you have to evaluate and decide for yourself where you want to go and what you want to do with them. And it depends on where you sit. If you're a software engineer, you're going to be thinking more about the interoperability part than a librarian who's thinking about the metadata versus the researcher who's thinking about discoverability and reusability. So it really depends on what your role is and where you are in the institution as to what parts of FAIR you're going to be most interested in. Forward. And you should try to support FAIR because it is a shared responsibility. You've got your team, your FAIR team, and it's an ecosystem of services. So you have repositories, you have PID resolvers, you have all kinds of different services linked into this FAIR ecosystem that needs to be supported and used. Forward. Here are some recommendations from a paper that I thought were really good. They sort of succinctly explain all the things I've been rambling about. Sorry, half of my screen has just disappeared, so I'm trying to remember what my screens look, or what my slides look like. But anyway, this is a good slide. Refer back to it because I think it really does summarize what we need to be doing. Forward. Yeah. Here are some of the resources. The top one is that 10 software thing. Here's a couple of groups, both European-based. Again, Europe has mandated FAIR pretty widely and have built it into a lot of things. So they're at a much different place than the US is. But that means we can start the way we need it as well. So this is a good spot for us to be in to figure out how we use FAIR and what's the best way that we can take these things and make the data ecosystem better for everybody. I believe that is it. So if we have any questions. Oh, We got about 10 minutes. Oh, next webinar. Sorry, I was gonna, Christine, do you want to talk about the next webinar?
Sure. So we have a webinar scheduled for Thursday, December 10th, same time, 9 Pacific, noon Eastern, and I think that's 6 Central European time, 6 p.m., let's say 1800. And we have a few different topics on the horizon: FAIR and AI, FAIR educational and training materials, a special FAIR implementation in the geosciences, and then a deep dive into FAIR implementation profiles and data stewardship plans. It can also be data management plans and publishing those as nano publications, and a deep dive on the 3-point verification strategy. As it gets closer to December 10th, we'll post the agenda for this webinar, but please save it on your calendar. So, and yes, we do have time for questions. You can use the Q&A, it's probably the easiest way. I also want to highlight the comment from Dan Katz that's in the chat and just point you at that. He says, given that software has been mentioned a few times, those interested in how FAIR applies to research software might want to follow this joint RDA Force 11 RISA group that's defining it. And so yes, I want to lift that up as well. And thank you, Dan, for being with us. So really, if you have any questions at all, either for Julian or about GoFair US, or just things you want to raise in general, we have a set of very interesting participants and leaders and research data in FAIR in the US. So it's will be a fun group to talk to.
Yeah. Any interesting FAIR stories?
So, and Julian, to make this a complete pandemic webinar thing, we enjoyed seeing your cat too.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. She seems to know when the video goes on.
I think if this was in February, that would have been like a strange occurrence, but now that's just
now it's normal.
It's just a normal work thing now.
Yeah.
Well, I'll give people another minute. Julian, thank you for, I really enjoyed the presentation. I always learn something when you present, and I always get a few laughs, so I appreciated that too. And I think you had Captain Kirk on just long enough before I got dizzy.
Oh, good.
I was on the edge of it, but not quite there. One of my not well used nicknames as a Kirkpatrick. So
I didn't realize I was doing a theme.
No. So have you taken part in any of those 10 things that are FAIR projects?
Oh, again, I hope you have a question.
Oh, okay, yeah.
What are plans and goals for the GoFair US office?
Sure, so if it's okay, Amy, I won't give you mission and vision statement type words that are meaningless. So we basically started out with training, building up training capacity, trying to find a way to support training of trainers, and also reusable and open curriculum. And not to say that it won't happen without GoFair US, but there are things that can be leveraged and there are gaps. Then in particular, another particular interest is launching and building out the network of networks of these FAIR data points, and also all the little tools that go around them, which will be a fun thing to deep dive into, but things such as how do you discover FAIR data points, the tooling for creating even the catalog entries on the FAIR data points, and I think a lot of the software that still needs to be created so these can be plugged into existing software platforms. And then of course, just generally furthering the conversation and trying to be a connector for what's happening in the other the FAIR groups, especially the different country offices in GoFair, and new things. So for example, FDPs, fair data points have been a huge theme, and now we're moving into the fair implementation profiles and what those means, and trying to adapt these for a US audience that might not be, completely sold or doing linked data. So I hope that's helpful and not too specific. I believe we have on our website some more information in the about, or it's in progress if it's not there already. Yes, action. Yes. I did show that data together slide for a reason. I think there are really important efforts going on in these other organizations, and we're part of those, and even where we're not in leadership, like the World Data, WDS is probably the good example there. We are users of the Core Trust Seal, so we try to bring all of that together and focus GoFair US on just things that are new, or that wrap things up that are otherwise would take too long for someone else to go and work out the way to implement something.
Christine, there is a question in the Q&A from Dominga.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay. Dominga asks, how do we work with the issue of sustainability given the funder-driven environment many of us have to work in? Yes, this is really the conundrum, and why we're not just sending out all the materials that come from the GoFair at large, because they have a very different landscape where you might have read the piece that Baron Mons put out promoting 5% of all research budgets to be devoted to data stewardship, and they actually have grants or grant portfolios that work like this. I believe the Dutch version of the NIH with their COVID awards, 5% for data stewardship, which is tremendous progress. But that's not something that we're seeing in the US. We do, of course, have many program officers who are committed to FAIR and are interested in funding FAIR, but the sort of changes that are need to happen at a higher agency-wide level. And then also it's difficult with the way our agencies work in a more patchwork system, and instead of some kind of roll up to an overarching mandate. So it's one of those things where no one's yet said the buck stops here and I'm paying for data stewardship. You talk to agencies, they say that institutions own the data, and so institutions should be making the investments in data. I can just tell you personally how I've tried to fund and move these services ahead is by partnering with research projects where it's been called out in a solicitation, or trying to convince researchers that it gives them an edge, not just for being competitive, but for reusing the data later. And with the huge interest in, call it AI, machine learning, deep learning, people are finally starting to understand data reuse and capturing your data in a way that it can be reused, even if you're not sure how later or by others. So I guess there's not a great answer for how we're going to fund all of these things. It's still finding patchwork, quilting some of your funding together. But again, I think that's why it's so important to focus on machine actionability and to be linked up with, the terms that everyone wants to use to talk about, because they're extremely applicable to the mission of machine learning. Yes, and Chris, feel free to unmute yourself if you want to say more.
Well, I have my daughter in the background, so hopefully.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I just added the link that said, personally, I feel like literacy is a big part of it, and I just shared a paper there in the chat that I still am like trying to read through at the moment, but it applies to fair literacy. So.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So all of that kind of pessimistic view on how things are in the U.S. is one side of it, but you know, we do make inroads every now and then. We talk to funders about trying some of these European style things where you have the idea of data management plans that are reused, ones that are already vetted for being fair, and that you could have some automated checking to look for compliance with the data management plan. And we have some new interest from agencies. So, you know, we'll try to push for the larger, all-encompassing things that would bring some sustainability and hopefully some more funding to the implementation of these things. But in the meantime, we'll have to make headway in our, you know, through 1,000 tiny actions. And I did want to thank Hannah Pergel for being on late. I know it's late in the evening. She's from Gopher International, and she's posted a link in the chat more about fair data points and the fair implementation profiles, or FIPs as we call them. So thank you again for being with us, Hannah. Okay, well, we're about at the top of the hour, so I think we will close the call and sign out. But our website is gofair.us, and please find us and please become involved. We'd love to continue the